Chapter 6: A Nation Reeling, September 12th and the Aftermath. The smoke hadn't cleared, and the world had already changed. The morning after the towers fell, America awoke to a silence unlike any before. It wasn't peace, it was shock. Skies were empty. Commercial air traffic across the United States was halted. Not a single plane passed overhead, a phenomenon not seen in over half a century. Streets that once bustled with honking cars and morning chatter now stood frozen. In New York, dust still blanketed abandoned cars. Windows remained shattered, and the smell of smoke mixed with the metallic tang of pulverized steel. Wall Street was closed, the first time since 1933. The New York Stock Exchange, normally a symbol of relentless movement and capitalism, sat dormant, watched over by National Guard troops and military trucks. Candles flickered on windowsills in Brooklyn. Flyers of the missing, once printed in haste and taped to lampposts, now curled at the edges. Faded, stained by rain and ash. Faces smiled from those pages. Wedding photos, graduation portraits, family snapshots. Beneath each, a name, a height, a workplace, and the words "last seen on September 11th. In cities across the nation, from Chicago to San Francisco, people lined up to give blood. Hospitals quickly realized they had more donations than survivors. In rural towns and inner cities alike, church pews overflowed. Strangers held one another without knowing why, only that they should. School children, too young to grasp the enormity, lit paper lanterns, whispered prayers, and asked innocent, impossible questions. It was the kind of mourning that didn't scream, it suffocated. The nation inhaled grief and exhaled fear. On the evening of September 11th, President George W. Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His face was pale, his voice steady but strained. Behind him, the American flag. The world watched. "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings," he said, "but they cannot touch the foundation of America." But it wasn't until September 14th that a defining moment occurred. Standing on a mountain of rubble at Ground Zero, arm around a retired firefighter, Bush grabbed a bullhorn. Survivors and workers gathered, dusty, weary, broken. Someone shouted, "We can't hear you." He replied, voice amplified through the cracked static, "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others wept openly. That brief, unscripted roar became the pivot, from paralyzing sorrow to righteous fury. In that instant, America stopped grieving and started bracing. Grief was not confined by borders. In London, mourners left flowers outside the U.S. Embassy and bowed their heads in silence. In Berlin, 200,000 people held a candlelight vigil at the Brandenburg Gate. In Rio, prayers echoed from hilltop churches to city favelas. In Tehran, despite government hostility, small groups lit candles behind closed doors. In Canada, firefighters gathered in solemn salute, standing still as bagpipes played. In France, the headline of Le Monde read, "Nous sommes tous Américains." We are all Americans. But grief was followed by anger. American families asked, "Who did this? Why us? How did they get in? Why didn't we stop them?" And across every living room, every office, every diner booth came a single, unifying question. What do we do now? At the pit, as the smoldering remains of Ground Zero came to be known, search and rescue teams worked around the clock. The smoke rarely lifted. Fires burned underground for weeks. Dogs trained to find survivors grew depressed, frustrated at locating only corpses. Families gathered near the barricades. Some held pictures. Others brought flowers. Many brought nothing but hope. For days, the rescue effort persisted. But hope was fleeting. By the end of the week, the mission shifted. The search for survivors became the grim recovery of the dead. Bucket brigades passed debris hand to hand. Welders cut twisted beams. Chaplains knelt beside newly found remains. The fire beneath the rubble, both literal and emotional, refused to die. Volunteers poured in by the thousands. Off-duty medics, retired police officers, construction workers, teachers, people with no special skills but one burning need: to help. Casseroles were handed out with tears. Gloves were offered with hugs. One woman from Kentucky stood for 12 hours each day handing out peanut butter sandwiches, whispering, "Thank you," to each worker. As the magnitude of the attacks crystallized, so did the failures. All 19 hijackers had entered the U.S. legally, 4 were known to intelligence agencies. 2 had overstayed visas. Several had taken flight lessons. Airport security had allowed box cutters on board, legal at the time. The FAA had issued warnings, but no one coordinated with NORAD. Critical messages were lost in bureaucratic webs. America learned a painful truth. This was not only an external assault. It was an exposure. A system meant to protect had fractured. The White House responded quickly. The Office of Homeland Security was created. Airport security was federalized. The TSA was born. Within weeks, metal detectors appeared in government buildings, stadiums, and shopping malls. Surveillance networks expanded. Air marshals joined commercial flights. The phrase, "If you see something, say something," became national gospel. In this new America, freedom was still cherished, but now it came with disclaimers. The death toll reached nearly 3,000. But these were not numbers. They were mothers, fathers, brothers, daughters. They were janitors and CEOs, flight attendants and fire chiefs, immigrants who had just arrived, veterans who had served. Obituaries filled entire pages of local newspapers. At Yankee Stadium, a single firefighter's funeral brought 3,000 mourners and 30 bagpipes. Churches on Long Island read name after name. One obituary read, "He loved the Beatles, hated mushrooms, and danced like nobody was watching." Another, "She made the best lasagna in Brooklyn and believed in angels. We hope she's one now." These weren't just victims. They were stories unfinished. In the days that followed, another darkness crept in: suspicion. Muslim Americans, some who had lived here for generations, became targets. Mosques were vandalized. Hijab-wearing women were harassed. Sikh men mistaken for Muslims faced attacks. In Mesa, Arizona, Balbir Singh Sadi, a Sikh gas station owner, was murdered 5 days after the attacks. President Bush visited a Washington mosque on September 17th. "The face of terror," he said, "is not the true faith of Islam, but fear does not heed words. It listens only to echoes." Flags were raised. Unity banners hung in malls. But in many places, walls between neighbors began to rise, built from rumor, fueled by rage. Just 45 days after the attacks, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act. It allowed secret wiretaps, expanded surveillance, and gave law enforcement new powers to detain suspects without formal charges. Access to medical records, financial accounts, and even library borrowing history was now legal under national security clauses. Many saw this as necessary. "We're at war," they said, but others feared the erosion of rights. What would we become in the pursuit of safety? What was the price of peace if it meant being watched? For the first time in modern history, the American public faced an impossible equation: security versus liberty. And the answer wasn't clear. The Bush administration quickly named Osama bin Laden and his host, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, as responsible. On September 20th, Bush addressed Congress with a message that reverberated across the globe: "Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists." When the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden, the U.S. prepared for war. On October 7, 2001, Operation Enduring Freedom began. American bombs fell on Taliban training camps and Al-Qaeda strongholds. Warplanes filled Afghan skies. The war had no borders, and no clear end. For the first time in its history, NATO invoked Article 5 of its charter. An attack on one was an attack on all. Allies responded. Troops from Britain, Canada, Australia, Germany, and France joined the campaign. Intelligence flew in from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Pakistan. Even Russia offered air corridors. For a moment, the world stood not as factions, but as one wounded organism, united in pain and in purpose. Late-night comedy shows went off the air. Songs with violent lyrics were pulled from radio playlists. Movies with explosions were postponed or canceled. The nation's cultural pulse changed. Broadway dimmed its lights. News anchors wept on air. Children were taught to duck beneath desks, not for fire drills but for terrorism. In everyday speech, a new phrase appeared. Before September 11th, there was now a line across the American timeline. And everything, absolutely everything, would be measured against it. September 12th was not a day of vengeance. It was a day of reckoning, a day of candles on steps, of strangers embracing, of churches full and airports empty, of heartbreak, of resolve, and of a slow, smoldering realization. The world would never go back. The dust had not yet settled on Manhattan's streets, but the winds of war had already begun their course. The dead were still being named, the missing were still being hoped for, and in the dim light of televisions and hospital rooms and silent kitchens, Americans looked to each other and whispered, "What happens now?" That answer, still unfolding, would change the course of a century.